Tom and Jerry, Thomas Cleans the Bathroom 2.0. Introduction. Hello and welcome to another Tom and Jerry story. This is all about Thomas cleaning the bathroom. This is a second version of the story. Characters. Grandma is an elderly woman who is the owner of Thomas the troublesome cat. That is all I have to say. Enjoy the story. Plot. It is a peaceful spring day in Utica, New York. Thomas is raging his brains out at his Xbox. Grandma is mowing the lawn. A few seconds later Grandma hears death threats coming from Thomas's big fat mouth. Grandma then storms inside. A minute later Grandma walks upstairs to Thomas's bedroom while carrying a bag of cleaning supplies. A few seconds later Grandma drags Thomas downstairs. 1 minute later Grandma tells Thomas that he needs to clean the guest bathroom that hasn't been cleaned for 4 decades. Thomas screams at the top of his lungs. Grandma then hands Thomas a pile of cleaning supplies and a hazmat suit. Thomas puts the hazmat suit on. 1 minute later Grandma pushes Thomas and the cleaning supplies into the unknowns of the bathroom. A few seconds later Grandma pushes the dryer against the bathroom door. Thomas then opens a window to let the green mold that is floating everywhere escape the bathroom. A few seconds later Thomas grabs a mop. He then fills a bucket with water that has been sitting in the moldy faucet for 38 years. A minute later Thomas pours some soap into the moldy water. A few seconds later Thomas starts cleaning the disease-thriving floor. A few seconds later Thomas sees there is a layer of mold underneath the disease-thriving layer. A minute later Thomas's mop starts deteriorating. 4 seconds later the mop head ceases to exist. Thomas then grabs a brush. A few seconds later Thomas starts brushing the moldy toilet. A minute later Thomas's brush disappears out of sight. Thomas then screams with horror. A few minutes later Thomas starts power washing the bathtub. 2 minutes later Thomas manages to see 1 square inch of tile. Thomas then celebrates his tiny victory. 10 seconds later Thomas starts scrubbing the mildew sink with a toothbrush. 3 minutes later Thomas grabs a bottle of soap. A few seconds later Thomas tries to clean the disease-thriving floor again. 10 seconds later Thomas looks up. A few seconds later the swamp-like water in the bathtub is bubbling. Thomas then grabs a fly swatter for self-defense. 1 minute later the water starts flooding the floor. A few seconds later the water calms down. 3 seconds later Thomas resumes cleaning the floor. 2 minutes later the toilet starts shaking. Thomas then grabs a mop. A few seconds later Thomas starts hitting the toilet. 3 seconds later the toilet stops shaking. A few seconds later Thomas resumes cleaning the floor. 4 minutes later the toilet starts shaking violently. 3 seconds later the water in the bathtub starts splashing everywhere. A few seconds later Thomas sees a tentacle emerge from the bathtub. Thomas screams with horror. 4 seconds later the tentacle dives back into the water. Thomas then resumes cleaning, ignoring the impending doom. 3 minutes later 4 tentacles shoot out of the water. A few seconds later Thomas screams with horror. A minute later several mutant plants grow from the wall. A few seconds later the tentacles and plants start merging together. A few seconds later Thomas throws a mop at the mutant monster. A few seconds later the monster absorbs the mop. Thomas then starts screaming. Meanwhile Grandma is washing the dishes. A few seconds later Grandma starts barricading the bathroom door. Back in the bathroom Thomas is clinging to the sink. A few seconds later the plant tentacle monster starts sucking up the mold in the bathroom. A minute later the monster reaches its full size and power. A few seconds later Thomas starts clinging to the bathroom even harder. Then the monster eats the toilet. A few seconds later Thomas watches the tentacle monster start consuming the moldy air. 1 second later the sink starts wiggling. Thomas screams at the top of his lungs. A few seconds later Thomas grabs the handle of the bathroom door. The sink then gets ripped off the wall and sucked into the monster. A few seconds later Thomas grabs a broom. Thomas then gets into a battle with the plant tentacle monster. 3 seconds later the bathroom door starts bending. 4 seconds later Thomas crashes onto the floor. The door then gets ripped off. Thomas then manages to get the massive barricade that Grandma set up. A few seconds later Grandma tells Thomas he has to start cleaning the bathroom again. Thomas then runs away. A few seconds later Grandma sees the monster. 1 second later Grandma runs outside, through a wall. 3 seconds later Thomas and Grandma run to their neighbor's house. 1 minute later Grandma calls the police. 3 seconds later Thomas looks out of a window. Thomas then screams while the monster starts oozing out of the house. 3 seconds later Thomas and Grandma sprint outside. A few seconds later Grandma watches her house get eaten. A few seconds later Grandma and Thomas scream with horror. A few seconds later the monster starts moving towards the neighbors' houses. A few seconds later everyone in the neighboring house evacuate. A minute later a police car pulls up. Grandma then explains everything. The police officer then sees the plant tentacle monster. A few seconds later the police officer calls for backup. A few seconds later the monster eats the police car. 3 seconds later the police officer screams. 4 seconds later everyone run away. 1 minute later everyone sees the monster is following them. They then get on a city bus. 10 minutes later they arrive at a school. A few seconds later a police officer throws a piece of C4 at the monster. A few seconds later the monster explodes and ceases to exist. Everyone then celebrates. The end. Conclusion. Hello there. I hope you enjoyed this Tom and Jerry story. More stories to come. Bye for now.